All right, guys, welcome back to Unit 3. We are going to push forward here and take a look at the War of 1812. Um, Remember, we've spent a lot of time in this unit looking at how successive administrations, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, were all desperately trying to avoid war at all costs. It was Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State, James Madison, who famously said that war is the enemy of democracy. Many of these early presidents and their administrations understood that the risk of going to war certainly outweighed the potential benefits. But what we're going to see, ironically, it's going to be President James Madison who is going to lead the country into war. And when you think about this War of 1812, really keep in mind that in many ways this is a war of choice. This is the United States making the active decision here to go to war with Great Britain. And so when we look at the causes why we ultimately decide to go to war here, many of them were long-standing issues that had plagued administrations going all the way back to George Washington. For one thing, and we've talked a little bit about this already in some detail, but one of the problems facing the country in the lead up to the War of 1812 was purely economic. When we look at the period of 1803 to 1812, the Napoleonic Wars start to take on a new level of intensity. And as those wars heat up, Britain and France both start blockading each other. And what that meant was that American merchant vessels simply could not enter French and British ports because each other's navies were keeping out commerce from arriving to all these cities and ports. So this is a major problem facing the United States. And as we talked about, the Jefferson administration tried to deal with this problem by negotiating very aggressively with the British and the French. And the way they did that was to impose an embargo on all foreign trade. And as we discussed already, this embargo was an absolute economic disaster for the United States. It slips the country back into a deep recession. And so when you take a step back and look at it, many Americans are asking themselves, when are we going to break these cycles of vicious economic turmoil and recession, which have really plagued the country since, honestly, the period of the American Revolution? And so there are some Americans who are starting to ask themselves, what if going to war here finally would somehow break this vicious cycle of economic turmoil and recession? And so the economic pressure is building up to do something, and that's why we're going to see partly the United States decide that a war with Britain could solve the country's economic problems. Additionally, something that we've already seen, but again, it heats up in a pretty dramatic way, are the British impressment policies. And as you can see from the statistic, by 1807, some 6,000 American citizens have already been seized by the British Navy and impressed into naval service. And like we saw during the Washington administration, the Madison administration by 1812 does not have an answer for this problem. Simply put, this is a complete violation continually of U.S. sovereignty. And so, again, people are starting to call for war as a way to solve this problem. One of the other things we see, guys, is usually when we choose to go to war, as opposed to a war being imposed upon us, when we choose to go to war, there's usually a great deal of domestic political pressure to do so. And that is certainly true for the War of 1812. By the time we get to the War of 1812, what we have are a new generation of political representatives who were known at the time as the War Hawks. These war hawks are not the founding fathers. The founding fathers, in many ways, for all of their faults, were certainly men of stature. They were statesmen. They were intellectuals. They understood the sort of delicate realities of politics and governance. These war hawks, many of them were born either during or immediately after the Revolution. They are very young, very energetic, and super, super nationalistic. These guys, in many ways, are the saber rattlers, as the name kind of indicates, and they are predominantly not Federalists. These are Democratic Republican congressmen who are being elected from southern and western states. These guys believe the United States should immediately go to war with Great Britain. And they are really ramping up the calls here to go to war with Great Britain for a number of reasons. Again, a lot of them are related to the issues we've already talked about. Many of them, for instance, are talking about impressment as a violation of American sovereignty. The only way then to restore American honor is to declare war on Great Britain. But the Warhawks also in many ways represent the territorial aspirations of southern and western constituencies. The Warhawks, for instance, are arguing that if we go to war with Britain, we can invade and seize Canada. Southern Warhawks are also arguing that it would be ideal at this point to take Florida in order to spread slavery and cotton down there. And so this is a major problem, and we're seeing James Madison, when he's president, is really trying to deal with these Warhawks, but he's under a lot of pressure from them to do something bold like declare war. And you can see here two examples of the Warhawks, Henry Clay on the left from Kentucky and John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. Pay attention to Calhoun because we are going to be spending a lot more time with him later on moving forward. Finally, the last pressure point that ultimately is going to push the United States to declare war on Great Britain was that by the 18 teens, we see increasing conflicts between American settlers and Amerindians that live in the Mississippi Valley. This region, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, parts of Tennessee, this is the region that was gradually being settled, and its settlement was being accelerated thanks to the Louisiana Purchase. We have a couple 100,000 Amerindians in this region, and as you can imagine, they are terrified about the prospects of waves of settlers moving in and acquiring their land. Well, what really makes matters worse here is that by the 18 teens, we know the British government has sent agents into this region. The region is very insecure. There isn't a huge federal government or military presence in this region. And what they're trying to do, they send agents basically to sign treaties with local Amerindian tribes who are very anti-United States government, and to basically convince these tribes to start attacking U.S. troops, settlers, plantations. And what the British government is telling these Amerindians is that, look, if the United States somehow decides to declare war on us at some point, we will intervene on your behalf, and we will basically protect your land interests. And so for many Amerindians who are under extraordinary pressure, those alliances were very appealing. And so there's this real sense, as you can see from this image right down here, there's a real sense among many Americans that the British are purposely, which they are, they're purposely antagonizing the Amerindians and making matters very difficult for U.S. troops and militias and citizens that are in this region. And so that in many ways is kind of like the final straw to push the United States government to recognize that Great Britain clearly is interested in undermining the sovereignty of the United States. And so by the year 1812, it's pretty clear. James Madison believes he has justification here for a declaration of war. He's under tremendous political pressure to do so. And so he does approach the Congress, and he asks them to take up their constitutional responsibility to debate and vote on whether or not they're going to give him a declaration of war. This is the first time in U.S. history, in the history of the young republic, that there is this debate in the Congress about whether or not to declare war on a foreign country. And fittingly, this declaration process was highly, highly contested. If you look at it, it's actually one of the closest votes in favor for war in American history. For the most part, the southern and western states, which are predominantly controlled by Democratic Republicans, they want the war. They aggressively vote for it. It was the northern states and the Federalist Party, which dominated in those states, which was adamantly opposed to the war. This makes sense when you think about who the Federalists are, what their goals are, their concerns. They believe that antagonizing the British would be a big mistake for the United States. They have strong economic relationships with Great Britain in the New England and Mid-Atlantic states. And so the northern states were very concerned about this push for war coming predominantly from the southern and western states. As the war unfolds, what you're going to see is the Federalist Party was so opposed to this war from the get-go that in 1814 the leaders of the Federalist Party held a convention in Hartford, Connecticut, where the Federalist Party literally debated secession. The war was going so badly, they had warned their fellow Americans that this war would be a mistake for the United States, and they literally debated whether or not the New England and Mid-Atlantic states should secede from the Union. Even though they obviously did not choose secession, once it gets into the newspapers around the country that the Federalist Party was debating leaving the Union because of their opposition to the war, um, as you're going to see, a majority of Americans who were very, very nationalistic at this time, who wanted the war, they're going to punish the Federalist Party for what they see as their basically un-American attitude when it came to the War of 1812. So, as the Federalists warned, a big victory for the United States was not necessarily inevitable. In fact, it's not even going to be a reality once we go to war here with Great Britain. The British take their time. They do very quickly blockade most American ports, which just devastates the American economy even further during the War of 1812. As you can see here, the key areas in the Mid-Atlantic and New England, as well as the South, that are blockaded by the British Navy. And then by 1814, the British send an invasion force up the Chesapeake Bay with the goal of capturing the major port cities as well as the U.S. capital, which they do. In August 1814, the British march on Washington, they sack the city, and then they burn it to the ground. You can see here the Capitol building had not even been completed yet, and they would basically have to start from scratch after it was burnt out by rampaging British soldiers. A few weeks later, the British Expeditionary Force then makes its way up the Chesapeake Bay with the goal of taking the critical port city of Baltimore. This is, I guess, something of an American victory. The city does not fall because it was successfully defended at Fort McHenry, which blocked the opening to the port of Baltimore. And as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, this is famously where an American writer named Francis Scott Key was on board one of these British ships here, and he witnessed the intensity of the British bombardment against Fort McHenry. And to his shock, the next day, the fort still stood, and the flag, which you can see here, the original flag, still flew over Fort McHenry, thus giving him the inspiration for what will be eventually our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. So the city doesn't fall. We successfully hold on to the city. But again, overall, the war is just not going very well in the Mid-Atlantic. Where the war went a little bit better for the United States was down in the Mississippi Valley and the Mississippi Delta. Down here, the command was given to General Andrew Jackson, whose ragtag army, and I do mean it's a ragtag army, it consists of professional U.S. soldiers, citizen militiamen, ordinary citizens and farmers, friendly Amerindians who align themselves with the United States, and even pirates. Andrew Jackson recruited pirates from the Gulf of Mexico who despised the British to fight in this army. He goes on a rampage across the Mississippi Valley, mostly attacking British-aligned Amerindian tribes and wiping them out all up and down the Mississippi Valley. Eventually, Jackson's army makes its way to New Orleans, where in January 1815, Jackson successfully defends New Orleans from a large British assault, arguably the most total victory for the United States in the war, and one personally very important for Andrew Jackson because his popularity after the War of 1812 basically enables him to make his way eventually to the White House. But what's interesting about Jackson's defense of New Orleans, it again shows how important slavery has become to the United States. On the cusp of the battle, Andrew Jackson gathers the leaders of the city, and he gives this really big, grand speech where he lays out to the people of New Orleans what's at stake if the British take the city. He's very clear, and he's probably right about this. If the British take New Orleans and then the greater Mississippi Delta, they're going to destroy slavery. They're going to abolish it wherever they go. And so Jackson gives this big stirring speech where he tells the people of New Orleans the very survival of American slavery and American cotton is here at stake in this battle. And that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but it certainly does beg the question of what if the British had taken the city. Jackson's able to defend it, and thus long-term American slavery is going to be secured. What's interesting, though, about the Battle of New Orleans is that technically this battle occurred weeks after the war actually ended. Andrew Jackson simply did not get the memo that the war had ended in December 1814. In December 1814, basically both sides look at the war as something of a stalemate. The United States wants this war to end because it's pretty clear if it goes on and on, we are not going to be able to defend the country from the British. The British also want the war to end because they see it as a distraction. They're really focused on Napoleon and putting really the final dagger into Napoleon's efforts in Europe. And so that's what they're fixated on, and they just want this war to go away. And so the two sides meet at a city and sign this so-called Treaty of Ghent. And it just ends the war, and it doesn't address any of the root causes of the war. It's as if the war wasn't even fought in many ways. We obviously don't get Canada. We don't get Florida from Britain's ally, Spain. Impressment does not end. The British obviously do not acquire any more territory. It's as if, again, nothing actually happened in this war. The Federalists are arguing that, see, we told you this war was a colossal waste of time and it nearly risked the long-term future of the Republic. On the other hand, a majority of Americans really stirred up by nationalistic sentiment during the War of 1812. Many of them look at this as a grand victory for the United States. Some Americans are even referring to the War of 1812 as the Second American Revolution. But believe me, it was not that. And as I've said, we are just very fortunate that we were not completely wiped out and taken over by the British government. This war, though, does have some important consequences moving forward. Some of them directly connected to the war, some of them not so much. Number one, what you'll see here is, you can make a note of this, the War of 1812 is really the beginning of the end for the remaining Amerindians who reside in the southeastern United States. Basically, if you look at the states of Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and into Louisiana, you still have large numbers of Amerindians who live in this region. Some of them suffered dearly during the War of 1812, but more generally, it's pretty clear the war enabled the U.S. government to complete its conquest and hold on these territories that will ultimately become states. And so it's just a matter of time, as we're going to see, a matter of decades really, before the Amerindian presence in this region is completely wiped out. Secondly, in terms of timing, the War of 1812 ends, and as it ends, the Napoleonic Wars are also going to come to an end in the year 1815. At the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon is finally defeated by the British and their allies. And so the timing was perfect, because what this meant is that as the wars ended in Europe and as they ended all the turmoil and insecurity in the Atlantic Ocean, all the impressment comes to an end, the intercepting of American ships comes to an end. All of that greatly benefits the United States because it's after 1815 and really for the next 50 years that the United States is going to enter a long sustained period of relative peace and tremendous economic growth, something it's been looking for really since the American Revolution. And so that is another consequence of this war, is how it does enable the United States to really move forward. Lastly, make a note of this. The War of 1812 brings about the end of the Federalist Party. The war unleashed rampant American nationalism, and Americans, whipped up in their nationalistic fervor, never forgave the Federalist Party for opposing the war to begin with. And so we see this in a matter of years. If you're a card-carrying member of the Federalist Party, you're probably going to want to switch parties because you are basically being run out of office at this point. And we see this as the years go by really 1820, the Federalist Party is virtually gone. Its leaders, as they are being run out of power, warn the American people that long term, they really believe the country is facing a severe threat from the Southern domination in the Congress. They're thinking about the Three-Fifths Compromise. They're thinking about the disproportionate power that the war hawks had in the Congress. And their argument is they dragged us into an unnecessary war, and long term, what is this going to lead to? Many former Federalists are greatly worried about the future of the Union with these very sort of aggressive and, frankly, in their view, almost sort of rebellious Southerners who seem to dominate and have way too much power. All right, so we're going to shift gears here now and look at that period of economic growth that I was just referring to. It's part of a broader period in the nation's history between roughly 1800 to 1830, excuse me, a period that's known as the Free Market Revolution. Now, this is not a revolution in the sense that it's a political or a violent revolution per se. It's a revolution in the sense of a period of extraordinary transformation that the country is experiencing. And what we're really focusing on here is the emergence of American capitalism, the American variant on capitalism, and how that is going to forever change the trajectory of the nation. Before we get into the emergence of a capitalist system itself, what we need to take a look at is what the vast majority of Americans, what their economic activity looks like by the year 1800. By the year 1800, if you get away from the port cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia, what you're going to see is an economy that we refer to as the inland economy. All you basically have to do is move in about 5–10 miles, and you're in a very isolated rural space where a majority of Americans reside and where most Americans engage in subsistence farming. In other words, they basically produce and grow what they need at home, basically to survive and be relatively comfortable. And so when we look at this economic system, in many ways, it's not that different from what pre-Columbian Amerindians engaged in before European arrival. You could argue that this inland economy has a kind of ecology to it. Certainly many of these subsistence farmers understood that they were part of broader systems of land and soil and natural resource use, and they understood that if you want to make it last over the long run, you have to engage in very sustainable practices. And so there are a lot of examples of how these farmers engaged in relatively sustainable practices. Many of them, for instance, engaged in crop rotation systems whereby you would grow different types of crops on different parcels of your land, and then you would rotate back and forth as you used up the soil in one place. You would then leave the soil alone and rotate eventually back to it. And by the time you rotate back to it, the soil health has returned. And so that's a very sophisticated understanding of sustainability. We know these farmers worshipped their almanacs, they learned about the land, they understood weather patterns, climate, seasonal changes that influence the best times to grow food. They couldn't access a marketplace, so for fertilizer, for instance, all they're simply doing is allowing their livestock to freely graze in their land and then having their livestock defecate in the land to provide a natural fertilizer. In many cases, they themselves will go to the bathroom in their own plots of land because there are no toilets, there's no, modern water infrastructure or anything like that. It's just understood as the recycling system, basically. So I know that's not too pleasant to think about, but that was the reality for many of these farmers. In many ways, they live the way many people do in the developing world today. This is a very pre-industrial economy. And what we also know is that because these guys can't access a marketplace, currency doesn't mean anything out here. What matters are the items that you have to trade, to barter. And so there is a bartering system among neighbors. Anything you want, but you could not produce yourself, you could also go to a local store, the town crossroads. You could access the local artisans and craftsmen, and then again, barter, trade with them, maybe some food items or livestock that you would have to trade. Above all else, guys, when you think about this inland economy that most Americans resided in, what keeps it intact really up until the year 1800 is that it's isolated. There are no roads. There are no mechanisms to actually access larger national and global markets. And so that's why self-sufficiency was so important to these subsistence farmers. Keep in mind, guys, when you're looking at this, I'm sure you're thinking of, who's the founding father who really looks at this type of economic system and believes it to be absolutely ideal. More than anything else, it's Thomas Jefferson. For Thomas Jefferson, his belief is that this type of inland economy with the yeoman farmer was critical to the future of democracy. The reality is many other people are looking at the inland economy as a place that is so isolated that it needs to be broken of its isolation in order to integrate it into a larger free market capitalist system. So something that's worth making a note of here is how the free market revolution that the country is about to experience is actually part of a much broader global process. This is part of something that we refer to as the breaking of the Malthusian trap. And so two key terms I want you to really make a note of, and I'll give you the context for this. One is the idea of the Malthusian trap, and the second is the great divergence, which is going to break this trap. Basically, guys, if you take the really long view, beginning around 10,000 BCE when human societies began engaging in agriculture, most economic systems were pre-industrial agricultural systems, and they experienced very limited economic growth, really up through the 1700s. So really 12,000 years of, as you can see here, on average, maybe 1% of economic growth per year. But something does start to complicate this story. Beginning in the 1300s and lasting through the 1700s, there were numerous technological and agricultural advances that actually increased population growth, but it increased population growth so much that the number of people starts to outpace food production. And so this lack of resources, especially food resources to sustain a growing population, this led to absolute turmoil, especially across Europe. And so we've already talked about examples of all this instability, but we have constant cycles of war, of political chaos, religious revivals like the Protestant Reformation. All of this is part of this greater problem of population growth outpacing food production. Think, for instance, about the English social crisis of the late 1500s, which we talked about. That is really a byproduct of this greater problem facing European societies. It's such a problem that by 1798, we have an English clergyman and a political economist named Thomas Malthus, who, assessing the situation in England proper, argues that basically the standard of living will never actually increase. In fact, it'll probably go down because population growth so surpasses the access to resources that the society has. In other words, what he argued is that the population boom in England and Europe basically was going to outpace the ability of societies to sustain those populations. This historians refer to as this idea of the Malthusian trap. Until societies could figure out how to dramatically increase production, they're not going to be able to increase the standard of living to sustain larger populations. Now, what ultimately breaks the Malthusian trap is what we call the Great Divergence, which is simply just a fancy term for the Industrial Revolution. By the year 1800, what we see across Europe as well as the United States is that a number of societies begin to figure out dramatic ways to increase their commodity production while lowering labor costs. In other words, now, through mass production, industrial technologies, they're able to dramatically increase food and all sorts of other commodity production here that can sustain growing populations. And so this revolution, again, predicated on the free market, on free trade, on the growth of industrial capitalism, it is certainly an incredible technology for social development. But it comes at considerable cost, as we're going to see. This type of capitalism that's developing, that's breaking the trap, it does start to create extremes in wealth and poverty, production, as well as labor exploitation. Especially in the United States, this type of production increasingly will be predicated on very low wage, cheap labor, as well as, of course, slave labor all over the southern states. But again, this chart will show you what the United States is experiencing. This chart is it shows you income per person across the planet from 10,000, or excuse me, 1000 BCE up to basically the present. The numbers here, one equals $1,800 today of income per person. So I know it doesn't seem like a lot, but this will show you how wealth is being generated across the globe. Basically, it's stagnant for most of human history, and then beginning here, you have the Great Divergence. These numbers are a little off, I apologize. They should actually be scooted over a little bit. So the year 1800 should actually be right here, and that's where you see this huge surge in global income and wealth levels. But again, the problem with this system is how the wealth is being increasingly concentrated at the very, very top. Always remember, guys, when we think about periods of great historical change, these things don't just happen out of the blue. In many ways, as I've talked about time and again in our class, is that ideas, culture, ideology are critical in influencing historical change. And one of the ideas that's starting to really take a hold and help spread this idea of free market capitalism is arguably the most important intellectual architect of the idea of a free market, a Scottish philosopher named Adam Smith. In 1776, the same year that the American colonists are rebelling against British mercantilism, Adam Smith publishes a book called The Wealth of Nations. In many ways, guys, when you think about the importance of the wealth of nations, the wealth of nations is to capitalism what Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto is to communism. That's how important this document is. It's kind of like the original Bible for capitalist thinking. Adam Smith is a classic Enlightenment thinker. He is a believer in liberalism. And what he argues in The Wealth of Nations is that individuals have inherent natural rights to pursue their self-interests and to acquire property and wealth without any interference. Smith, above all else, when you think about The Wealth of Nations, what he's arguing for is what he called the invisible hand. His criticism, in particular British mercantilism, is that mercantilism was too much of the visible hand. In other words, too much of government directing capitalist growth, telling you who you can and cannot trade with, that sort of thing. He argues that the invisible hand of the free market was a much more effective, much more rational, and much more fair way to direct economic life. In other words, we should not see the visible hand interacting in the marketplace. He believed that the market should be able to do what it's going to do. And when you think about markets, what they are in essence, it is really that question of supply and demand. Markets consist of producers and consumers responding to one another and making choices about production and the buying and trading of goods. Adam Smith's ideas are extraordinarily important, but in many ways what he's doing is giving intellectual ammunition to what Americans have been doing in their country even before the revolution. If you think about all the American smuggling we talked about, the violation of the Navigation Acts, Americans rebelling against taxation and against British mercantilism, that was their embrace of this idea of a free market where people can make choices on their own without anyone telling them what exactly they should be doing in that marketplace. Now, what's also going to enable the United States to more readily, more fully embrace a free market capitalist system is that the opportunities now are there for broader market access. Again, you can thank the Napoleonic Wars for this, because the Napoleonic Wars lead to the temporary decline of European economies, both in manufacturing and agriculture. Especially after 1815, we see European mercantilist approaches basically collapse after the Napoleonic Wars. And that means when you look at the broader Atlantic Ocean, Americans have more access now to broader networks of free trade. So more than anything else, we're going to see it's American producers and consumers who really stand to gain after the Napoleonic Wars, and of course in our country after the War of 1812, because this is all happening around the same time. You should also make a note of this, guys, is that there is a political equation to this as well, a political reason that the United States is going to more readily embrace free market capitalism. If you go back to the War of 1812, it exposed two real core problems facing the country when it came to its economy. One, you can see here, the war exposed that the lack of interconnected infrastructure, in other words, roads, bridges, transportation networks, really limited the ability of the United States to effectively mobilize when the British started to invade. The other problem was, by the time of the War of 1812, the first central bank of the United States had been dissolved. In 1811, the first bank, by law, had to dissolve. James Madison and the Democratic Republicans initially celebrated this. They saw the decline of the bank as very important because they saw it as infringing on the rights of ordinary Americans to pursue their self-interests. But when the bank disappeared and the War of 1812 came, U.S. paper currency was extraordinarily unstable without the central bank's regulations in place. And so that made raising money during the war very, very difficult. And more broadly, the country experienced a very debilitating economic recession during the War of 1812. And so what you get after the War of 1812 is actually a fracture, a fault line within the Democratic Republican Party. The Federalists have disappeared, and what you're left with is a one-party system. Democratic Republicans basically run the entire show. The problem was there are a new generation of Democratic Republicans who are beginning to argue that the purest Jeffersonian ideals, especially when it comes to limited government, the idea that government should not be involved in any aspect of the national economy, this new generation Democratic Republicans challenge that idea. They argue that there are some compromises we need to make with sort of pure Jeffersonian ideology. And one of those guys, we can zoom in on it here, was the old war hawk Henry Clay. Henry Clay argues for what he calls the American system, and he sees this as critical to the long-term future of the United States. In many ways, Henry Clay is utilizing a lot of Alexander Hamilton's original ideas from the 1790s. Henry Clay's American system argues broadly for three things. One, high tariffs, in other words, high taxes on cheap foreign goods in order to encourage and protect American manufacturing. Secondly, he believes the United States should absolutely charter a second central bank, a second bank of the United States, which it is going to do in 1816. In his view, this is critical to not only providing more standardized currency regulation, but also expanding a lot of credit access to other smaller banks and ordinary Americans who are looking to access credit in order to make investments in all sorts of purchases. Lastly, Henry Clay argued that above all else, the government needed to support what he called internal improvements. All of that is the infrastructure: roads, bridges, canals, railroads, as we're going to see. His view was that while we don't want the government controlling the marketplace, like we saw with the British, the government should be spending money to support innovation and technology that will then trickle out and also enable long-term economic growth and prosperity. Now, what we're going to do is take a look at various examples of all those internal improvements that what we see government basically invest in at a variety of levels. One of the first major technological revolutions that makes the spread of free market capitalism possible was the construction of roads and turnpikes. And we see it at all levels: federal, state, local governments, as well as even private companies, which began investing in road construction after the year 1806. In most cases, these roads were financed through toll systems. Basically, it's like a tax, but you pay as you use, pay as you go. And as I said, at all levels of government, we're seeing this investment in these types of internal improvements to spread the marketplace. One of the great examples is in 1806, during Jefferson's presidency, where the U.S. Congress authorized the building of a national road from western Maryland into the territories of the Old Northwest, Ohio, Indiana, and then by 1836, this national road even reached Illinois. And when you think about the construction of these roads, just always remember why they're so important. They are breaking into the inland economy and gradually integrating rural communities into broader marketplaces. Another example of one of these revolutionary technologies, certainly one of the most critical technologies that's going to make possible the Industrial Revolution, was the development of the steam engine in 1807 by an American engineer named Robert Fulton. Basically, what Fulton figured out is that you could harness the power of fossil fuels to propel any type of basically combustible engine. And so the fossil fuel in particular that he focused on was the burning of coal at very high temperatures. When you burn it, it then releases this steam that will then propel the engine. And so what he initially does is he takes that steam-powered engine and he puts it on a ship. This is absolutely revolutionary because if you think of thousands of years of human development, oceanic and river navigation always depended on two types of energy sources, either harnessing the natural ability of the wind to propel your ship or harnessing human energy. Robert Fulton's steam engine makes all of that obsolete. Now it makes basically oceanic navigation, river navigation possible virtually anywhere, including against the current and upstream. What we also see after the development of steam engine technology, especially with regards to ships, is that many entrepreneurs and ship companies began to argue that why should we basically be restricted by the bodies of water that nature naturally gave us? Why not start to create our own artificial waterways, which is exactly what begins to happen by the 1820s when various state governments and private companies began massive expansion of canal systems all over the United States, especially in the northern states. One of the best examples of this is the completion in 1825 of a 363-mile canal system known as the Erie Canal across upstate New York. The impetus to do this, basically, if you zoom in on the map here, you'll see, was to connect New York City at the bottom of the Hudson River right here to all of these communities on the Great Lakes in Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, which prior to the canal basically had to either go across land or all the way around Newfoundland to reach New York City, thus dramatically increasing the cost of transporting all sorts of commodities. The Erie Canal starts just here north of the state capital of Albany and then just cuts directly across upstate New York, thus more directly connecting all of these communities with the Hudson River and the markets of New York City. And you can see again the impact of all this canal expansion. By the late 1830s, we have over 3,000 miles of canals across the nation, and every year those numbers continue to increase. The next and arguably most important logical step with steam engine technology was taking the steam engine and putting it on some type of landed vehicle to dramatically increase the ability of markets to spread across geographic space. That, of course, brings us to the railroad. The railroad originally was a British invention, and by the 1820s, you started to see steam-powered railroads being experimented with across the United States. By 1828, you see the work begin on the nation's first commercial railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, which, a lot like the National Road, the whole point of that was to connect the Mid-Atlantic, beginning in Maryland, with the surging populations in states like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And this map gives you even better sense of just how transformative the railroads are. On the cusp of the American Civil War in 1860, you can see we have over 30,000 miles of rail lines across the United States. What you'll also see is predominantly 70% of those railroads existed across the northern states. Across the southern states, railroad development had always been very uneven. Southerners, for ideological reasons, simply did not like their state governments directly investing or subsidizing railroad construction, and so there just wasn't quite as much interest. Whereas in the northern states, as we're going to see, there is a fully integrated national network of railroads, which dramatically increases the economic power of the United States, especially because it is now concentrated in these manufacturing centers across the northern states. When we get to the American Civil War, we'll see in vivid detail how these decisions at the southern states to not invest, in as many railroads would come back to haunt Southerners during the war. I think it would probably be an understatement to argue that railroads had a long-term lasting impact on the nation. There's no doubt about it. At its most basic level, what the railroad enables the country to do is basically to conquer geography, to shrink time and space, and thus dramatically expand the reach of markets into the inland economy and beyond. Railroads also dramatically diminish travel time, which I'm going to show you here in a minute just exactly what that looked like. And also think about what the railroads and really steam engine technology more generally, the important long-term economic and environmental impact of these technologies. They fuel all sorts of new fossil fuel mining industries, especially in coal, but also iron ore, and then later on, by the late 1800s, the petroleum industry. As many of you are probably aware, this burning of fossil fuels to propel industrial growth really marks the beginning of a long-term trend in human civilizations altering the climate. As carbon emissions dramatically increased, global temperatures also increased. We have really sophisticated temperature data at the global level that goes back more than 200 years. And what you'll see is by the year 1800, where temperatures were relatively stable, year by year they start to go up, and then each year they increase really dramatically. That is corresponding directly with the dramatic surge in carbon emissions from industrialization. So obviously it would be an understatement to argue that railroads and steam engines and the Industrial Revolution more generally is going to have a lasting impact that we're, as a species, attempting to make sense of to this very day, as we literally change the very nature of life on the planet. One other aspect of railroads that's important to keep in mind is how the railroads literally changed our very conception of time itself. What I mean by that is, it is the railroad companies in the United States that ultimately invent time zones. They do this because prior to time zones, scheduling the railroads was an absolute nightmare, making railroad travel very dangerous. Basically, before time zones, the way human beings tell time was through the sun. When the sun reached its zenith, it was noon. And so what that meant is that basically there were thousands upon thousands of different noons depending on where you would go. Prior to time zones, it might be noon in Washington, D.C., but if you go out to Annandale, Virginia, it would technically be 11:56 a.m. The railroad companies, recognizing that that was a huge problem, by the year 1883, they sit down, lay out a map, and create 4 distinct time zones for the United States, basically to make scheduling much more economical and, frankly, much more safer. Here you can see the impact of all of these new transportation technologies on travel time across the United States. On the left, you see a map from 1800 and here 1830. And what these colors all indicate, as you'll see, is the average travel time within that particular geographic space. So for instance, if you were traveling from New York City to the new capital of Washington, D.C., and you were a New York congressman, it would take you on average 4 days to get to New York City in 1800. By 1830, that travel time is now cut down to 2 days. So that is a dramatic reduction, again, thanks to all of these technologies, roads, canals, railroads. Another example might be here, the city of Detroit. If you wanted to reach the city of Detroit from New York City, on average, it would probably take you around 5 weeks in 1800. By 1830, just 2 weeks. And as the decades go by, as we know, those technologies are only going to increase and thus more dramatically reduce travel time and thus increase the spread of the marketplace. Another example of how technologies are really shrinking time and space would be an example of the telegraph, which was absolutely revolutionary in the realm of communication. This was invented in the 1830s by an amateur scientist in New York City named Samuel Morse. Morse basically figured out that you could connect a cable or a wire to two telegraph machines and then send signals through those machines and then across the cable lines. Theoretically and in actual practice, the telegraph made instantaneous communication possible. And so what we see throughout the 1830s, 40s, and 50s is the spread of telegraph networks all across the United States. Even by 1866, as you can see here, the United States and Great Britain lay out the first transatlantic cable line, this massive cable line that just rested at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, that now made it possible basically within minutes to receive news of exactly what was going on in the United States or Europe. Initially, these telegraph machines were very, very expensive, and so in most cases, you only saw well-to-do businesses, corporations, and newspapers purchase them. But again, it dramatically changes the nature of the marketplace and how information spreads now. In the realm of capitalism, it makes it now possible for businesses to instantaneously send orders, send information, send receipts, send messages regarding the arrival of certain commodities. For newspapers, it meant being able now to instantaneously report the news. That way, today's newspaper was based on yesterday's news as opposed to news from 2 or 3 weeks ago. And all across the nation, the wires spread. You can see, like the railroads, by the 1860s, we have tens of thousands of miles of telegraph wire, sort of creating like a patchwork system all across the country. One other really important technological revolution was the development of what were called interchangeable parts. And it's worth making a note of really the biggest impact of interchangeable parts is that they're going to make possible the full-scale emergence of manufacturing and mass production. During the late 1700s, what we saw was an experiment by firearm makers with this idea of interchangeable parts. And the reason for that was, prior to the development of this idea of interchangeable parts, a rifle, for instance, was individually crafted by a single artisan or craftsman. That meant each rifle itself was absolutely 100% original and unique, but it also meant for the owner of that firearm that if the firearm broke down, if there was a problem with one of its parts, you would have to take it back to that craftsman and they would have to painstakingly repair the part or sometimes replace the entire rifle. So by the late 1700s, to make firearm manufacturing much more seamless to really increase profits, firearm manufacturers began experimenting with first producing uniform rifle parts that were all identical that you would then put together at the end of the process to form a single rifle. That way you could mass produce products, but it also meant that if one part of your rifle broke, you could just replace that single part. By 1801, the inventor Eli Whitney, who we'll come back to later on for another really important reason, it was Eli Whitney who began to really demonstrate the possibilities of interchangeable parts in the American factory system. His demonstration showed that factories more generally for any real product could utilize interchangeable parts to dramatically increase mass production and thus profits. In other words, it's like breaking the Malthusian trap. You can see the great divergence in work here because when you dramatically cut your labor costs and increase mass production, you lower the price of commodities and thus raise the standard of living. Interchangeable parts were integral to that story. As we see, guys, by the early 1800s, the full spread of American capitalism is also changing the very nature of economic behavior in the United States. One of the clearest examples of how people's economic behavior and how they do business is changing was the full-blown emergence of credit in American society. Contrary to what um, Ben Franklin argued during the colonial period, increasingly during the market revolution, taking out debt, accessing credit was not seen as enslavement. It was not seen as losing your freedom, but increasingly credit, access, and debt were critical to entrepreneurship and for any American citizen to really pursue capitalist ambitions and acquire wealth. And so we see Americans really moving away from this fear of debt and increasingly embracing it as critical to their long-term economic prospects. And a couple examples of how credit is really starting to emerge as a critical component of our economic system. Think about the central banks of the United States. It began with the first Bank of the United States, and then it really blossomed with the Second Bank of the United States, which was established in 1816 and will be in place for 20 years. It's during that Second Bank of the United States that you really see the dramatic emergence of banking and credit in the United States. Depending on where you go and which particular parts of the country, the use of credit tended to look a little differently. In the northern states, typically, people that are accessing credit through various banks are doing so in order to purchase a lot of land for commercial food production and the investment in all sorts of new manufacturing operations. In the southern states, it's somewhat similar, but the commodities themselves are a little bit different. Southern planters typically are accessing credit through all sorts of southeastern banks in order then to buy on debt, all sorts of parcels of land for cotton production. And of course, credit is dramatically enabling speculation in the slave markets, people buying up lots and lots of slaves on borrowed money. What we see with credit is that credit is absolutely critical to a capitalist system, to its ability to function. You can't argue against that. But what it also has a tendency to lead to, if it's not a healthy use of credit, as we see in the United States during this time, it typically will lead to cycles of speculation, cycles of really unsustainable debt, and as we're also going to see, currency bubbles. If the flow of credit is basically unchecked, it can lead to a lot of economic growth, but it can also lead to the economy to crash during various cycles, as we're going to see. Along with credit, there are a number of other examples of how this country was embracing a full-blown market society. And one of the best examples was this move away from Thomas Jefferson's dream of an agrarian republic of self-sustaining yeoman farmers to a republic that increasingly is embracing full-blown commercial, or as it was called at the time, market farming. This story really is all about the death of the inland economy. With the rise of these transportation technologies, credit, and the flow of market ideas, those once isolated American farmers now have the ability to start engaging in the pursuit of profit. Subsistence becomes far less important because now you have the ability to grow a lot of food and raise a lot of livestock in excess. Especially across the northern states, we see the full-blown emergence of market farming as it integrated very isolated rural communities into what were emerging as urban manufacturing centers for the trade in all of those commodities. There are a lot of historical examples, pieces of historical evidence that show how farmers are making the move away from subsistence and towards commercial or market farming. For one thing, what we start to see farmers do after the year 1800 is they start to keep really detailed record or account books. They're doing this now because their operations are becoming a lot larger. They feel the need to track production, track profits, losses, those sorts of things. If you go back to the inland economy farmer, why would a subsistence farmer need an account book to keep track of the 3 pigs that he owns? If he can't count those 3 pigs, he certainly has a larger problem. But by the time the inland economy starts to disappear, market farmers now own 300, 400, maybe thousands of pigs. You need to be able to keep detailed records and data about what's going on in your farming operations. This also includes increasingly evidence that shows landowning farmers hiring out farmhands and tenants to work the land, paying them wages. Again, in the inland economy, that would never be necessary because your plots of land were never big enough to hire out other people. Now you're making enough money that you need to bring in more labor to, again, keep your production costs low. We also know across the northern states that all that credit you can access at the banks is enabling all sorts of commercial farmers now to buy up more land by taking out mortgages on that land, buying up all sorts of new technologies by, again, borrowing money to buy those technologies, which will then also dramatically increase your production. You can see 2 examples of those technologies here that were sought after by commercial farmers. 1837, we see the development of the steel tip plow by John Deere. John Deere does this because he recognized that the farther west you got, especially into the Ohio Valley, the soil was very rich, but it was very tough. A wood plow simply could not dig into that soil. So instead, he takes American steel, puts it on a plow. Even years before that, in 1831, you see a company called McCormick, which developed the mechanized reaper. The idea was to dramatically cut your labor costs and increase production now by making the reaping of the land itself far more mechanized, which again greatly benefits commercial farmers. And these two maps just show you, beginning in the 1820s and well through the 1840s, how dramatic food production is across the northern states. I know we typically think of the sort of dichotomy between the North and the South prior to the Civil War as the North being predominantly industrial and manufacturing in nature and the South predominantly agricultural. But that dichotomy doesn't fully work when you really look at the nitty-gritty. In reality, yes, the southern states were predominantly engaged in very intensive agriculture, but that was predominantly cash crop agriculture, especially cotton. If you go up to the northern states prior to the Civil War, yes, most of the manufacturing industrial base is concentrated in those northern manufacturing centers. But the North also far surpassed the South in terms of its agricultural production. Most Northerners were actually engaged in very intensive food production across their states, as you can see from these two charts. And so we are going to see this when we get to the Civil War. Not only is that food production and manufacturing leading to a dramatic surge in northern population, but it's also going to enable the Union, the United States, to effectively feed itself during the Civil War, whereas the South is going to have a serious problem maintaining its armies and feeding its population because it had been so dependent on cash crops as opposed to food production for all those years. Now, eventually, when you take into account all these other factors, the expansion of transportation technologies, interchangeable parts, the expansion of credit, commercial food production, all these things that are really changing the economic processes in the country, it's not terribly surprising that by the 18 teens, 1820s, we see the beginning of an American system of manufacturing. This in many ways had been the long-term dream, of Alexander Hamilton. He just did not live to be able to see it really sort of fully articulated. And so what we're looking at here is the rise of factories. Factories, if you recall, are really the bane of Thomas Jefferson's existence. His fear was that if the country embraced manufacturing, the republic itself would ultimately be corrupted by everything that came with manufacturing. But the reality was factories were coming. And this does have an extraordinary change on the very nature of not just economic growth, but the very nature of work, the very nature of labor in America. Let's take a look at what's actually driving the emergence of factories in the United States. Keep in mind, there is manufacturing in the United States, even going back to the Revolutionary period. But traditionally, the way manufacturing operated, it was typically skilled artisans or craftsmen, highly skilled people who owned their own businesses. Usually they operated their businesses as small shops, usually on sort of the first floor of a 2 or 3-story home. And what they then had the power to do was to control the pace and the intensity of their own labor. If, let's say, for instance, if we follow a shoe manufacturer, a shoe craftsman, that shoe craftsman wakes up in the morning, they have all sorts of skills, they build the entire pair of shoes themselves. And that shoe shop owner basically decides how many pairs of shoes he is going to produce in a single day. But something starts to happen in this country. Beginning in 1807 and then accelerating through the War of 1812, if you think about all the problems that this country faced with the embargoes and the blockades, and then all the vulnerabilities that were exposed during the War of 1812, it led many American merchants and entrepreneurs to reassess the state of manufacturing in this country. Up until that point, for the most part, Americans were dependent on getting most of their goods from abroad. After the War of 1812 and the Napoleonic Wars, many American investors came to the conclusion that creating a manufacturing base in the United States offered all sorts of unquestionable advantages, as we're going to see. And so what begins to happen by the 1820s is entrepreneurs who now access a lot of credit, they have money to spend, they began making investments in new manufacturing operations. What they initially did, they would go into communities and they would gather those artisans and skilled craftsmen and they would hire them out to work in what these entrepreneurs called workshops. Basically, these are the factories. But what they would do to keep their labor costs low, they would subdivide all the tasks of those workers. So again, if you go back to that shoe manufacturer who owned his own business, he's being approached by this big time investor who's saying to him, I'm about to open a workshop. I'd love for you to come work for me. That shoe craftsman basically has two choices. He can either say no and try to compete with this very large factory that's going to mass produce cheap goods, or he can go to work for this guy. And the reality is most of these artisans, even though they're going to be resistant early on, are going to recognize that rather than lose everything, they would rather earn wages from these entrepreneurs who are running these factories. The problem that many of these former artisans start to recognize, though, is that as their tasks are subdivided, that can then lead to the employers, the owners of these factories, to justify paying them much lower wages. The argument being, hey, I don't need you to build the whole shoe. I just want you to build the laces or the sole or tan the leather, whatever it may be. And so this system, again, because it cuts labor costs, it dramatically increases mass production. But it has, as you can imagine, all sorts of long-term implications for the country. When you look at these factories or these workshops as they're popping up, what we're seeing is that for one thing, the entire assembly process is broken down into distinct sections or tasks. So that means all these former craftsmen who are now wage earners are responsible for that specific task, meaning they basically have less skill and training. You just simply don't need as much skill to put together laces instead of an entire pair of shoes. What's also increasing the assembly process is those interchangeable parts that we already talked about. That makes assembly and production much easier and much faster, thus increasing production and increasing your profit margins. The problem, though, ultimately, is that these new wage earners who used to be their own property owners, their own businessmen, now they feel like they're losing some semblance of their independence and their freedom because they find themselves under constant management and supervision. They're finding that they are under pressure to increase output. They no longer control the pace of their own labor. And they're doing this as they're seeing their wages go lower and lower and lower. But again, their argument is, you have less skill, so we can pay you a much lower wage. And unfortunately, it works for the owners of those factories and those workshops. By the 1830s, this is really the predominant manufacturing system across the United States. So much so that both Americans and Europeans on the other side of the Atlantic start referring to it as the American system of manufacturing. And if you want to define it, you can see what we're talking about right here. You bring all these elements together, and what you get is the mass production of interchangeable parts assembled by cheap and abundant labor. It was the United States that pioneered this system. It's what's going to enable the United States to become a manufacturing superpower by the middle of the 20th century. But it's also the system now that other countries have taken and basically are beating the United States at its own game. With the rise of manufacturing, especially in the northern states, we see in conjunction with that the rise of this new type of laboring system, a system based on predominantly low-wage labor in these manufacturing centers and workshops. But one of the initial problems that many factory owners had was, frankly, where are we going to get these laborers from? In the 18 teens and 1820s, many of those native-born skilled artisans and craftsmen were, as you can imagine, very resistant to taking on wage labor jobs and then losing their businesses. And so early on, without an access to a lot of cheap native-born male labor, what we see a lot of these factory owners, especially in the New England mill towns, the textile industry, what they start to do is they start to run experiments in hiring out young girls and younger women to work in these factories for very low wages. Again, this is more out of necessity than anything else. what many of the textile factory owners who are setting up shop across the states of Massachusetts and Connecticut and New York, what they start to realize is there's an untapped labor source surrounding all of their mill towns and factories. A lot of the communities around there were still very rural. They were part of that dwindling inland economy that was starting to wither away. And what you had were family farms with young unmarried women and girls who were seen basically as ideal to recruit into your factories. And so these factory towns were basically going out and actively recruiting these women to work for very low wages. But what they also had to do was to reassure the very patriarchal heads of these family farms that to allow their daughters to go to these factory towns, their daughters were not going to be threatened with corruption, that their daughters were at the same time as working, were also going to become moral, upstanding citizens. And so that's why you see these factory towns, especially the most famous of which, Lowell, Massachusetts, they not only build their factories, but as they're recruiting these young women to work, they're building lecture halls where mandatory lectures in work ethic and good, wholesome moral values are taught to these female workers. They build boarding houses, dormitories, where all the female workers were required to live under very strict supervision. These towns had their own churches, again, for the moral education of these women. And many of these towns even had their own company newspapers, like this one down here from Lowell called the Lowell Offering. And as you can imagine, these newspapers ran stories and editorials about good workers obeying their bosses, not engaging in any sort of immoral activity with any local men, that sort of thing. And so that type of surveillance system, supervision system is designed again to reassure these family farms that if they let their daughters leave their farms to go work, that their daughters are going to be in good hands. Now, I'm sure many of you will look at this and say to yourselves, why would I ever allow myself to live under that type of supervision? But what you have to understand for many of these young women who went off to work in the textile industry is that this was really their first opportunity at some semblance of independence, of being able to leave the constraints of their home and their fathers in particular. And so it was very appealing to these workers, even when their wages were extraordinarily low, to actually build some semblance of professional independence. What was also very appealing for many of these female workers was their ability to build bonds, friendships, and relationships with the other women they worked with in these textile mills. And so what we'll see long term is that these textile mill girls in New England, they never really became a permanent class of full-time workers. Especially as immigration starts to increase, factory owners started to turn to non-native born men who they could also pay low wages to. But these first female workers are an important example of one of the sort of earliest experiments in female workers, full-time workers, even though they weren't permanent, but full-time workers in one sector of the American economy. More broadly, guys, it's important to consider the sort of long-term ramifications of wage labor in the United States. Broad-scale wage labor, an entire class of Americans who are now earning wages, especially in manufacturing, in the factory system, is a completely new experience in the United States. Again, this is concentrated predominantly in the northern states, and so it does lead to some new possibilities, but also new problems for American workers. You can see here the statistics. The numbers are not huge, but they are significant because prior to the 1830s and 1840s, 95% of Americans basically are not working for wages necessarily, although many of them were land renters. Many of them are working as rural agricultural workers in some capacity. But as the years go by, 1840, 1850, the numbers of workers earning wages in the factory system increase. And that challenges the very notion of a work ethic in America. You know, if you go back to Thomas Jefferson and his yeoman farmer, the work ethic was always pretty clear. Whatever you produce, that's on you. And so that in of itself, this idea of having to be self-sustaining for the very survival of your home and your family, that was a powerful motivation. But for many native-born workers who now find themselves under the pressure of wages and supervision, that work ethic was not useful anymore. And so what we get with the American factory system is also a new work ethic. In many ways, this is critical to the whole notion of working for wages. As you can see, workers start to embrace a couple of ideas about the virtues of their wage labor in the factories. For instance, many of them adopted the notion that there was a self-reliance involved in the factory system. You relied on yourself to improve yourself through hard work in the factory system. You also saw many people, the factory owners themselves, which isn't surprising, but many people start to argue that the factory is not something that should be feared, but the factory can inherently be a moral force that could lift an entire class of people out of poverty. The harder you work, the more wages you earn, the more readily you'll be able to eventually move up the ladder in the manufacturing system. You start at the bottom. Hard work, self-reliance, improvement, all these things can increase your own economic mobility by opening up better opportunities. Many workers convince themselves of that wage labor, low wage labor will ultimately lead to a better life. On the other hand, though, there's no doubt about it, many early wage earners were deeply concerned about the other ramifications of wage labor. For many, wage labor was associated with the loss of independence, because now you depended on someone else for a wage. You were no longer self-sufficient. You were no longer your own businessman. That in itself was seen as the very idea of what freedom was, to be that self-sustaining property owner, something that goes all the way back to English colonization in what will be the United States. Now we see in the 1830s and 1840s a new term starting to develop, a not so positive term, the idea of wage slavery. And you see many workers who are greatly fearful of this idea that wage labor creates dependency. You are dependent now on someone else for your wage. That person has a deep amount of control over you, and thus it is basically a form of enslavement. As we all know, wage slavery is not actual slavery, but you do see workers' organizations begin to argue that the exploitation of workers through low wages is basically a form of control and enslavement. But again, it is nothing compared to actual slavery as what we're seeing develop in the American South. So not surprisingly, with the dramatic expansion of the marketplace, capitalism, and manufacturing, we start to see the early stages of sort of a larger pace, a greater pace of urbanization in America. Again, to the dismay of people like Thomas Jefferson, who saw cities as basically a long-term threat to the Republic. But the cities are coming. Now, when we look at urbanization during the early 19th century, it is nothing compared to the urbanization we're going to see by the late 19th and early 20th century. But urbanization nonetheless is occurring. Cities start to grow in increasing importance because they are now the centers of banking, of private entrepreneurship, of where all the factories and skilled artisans are located. And of course, it's where a lot of the cheap labor is also flooding into. Older port cities start to grow, become even more important thanks to increased global trade, especially up in the northern states, whereas southern cities became important hubs for cotton exporting, being able to access credit, and of course being able to purchase slaves. But what's so incredible about the market revolution is how, because transportation technologies basically conquer geography and diminish geographic disadvantages, you start to see cities that emerge out of nowhere with no apparent geographic advantage, because now, as long as they can access the railroads and the canals and the other technologies, they can become incredible hubs for manufacturing. Couple examples here of these new Western cities that are starting to emerge out of nothing. First of all, there's the great example of Chicago. Beginning in the 1840s, railroad and land speculators showed up Chicago. They laid out a map, and they basically determined this could be a critical processing and transportation center for all sorts of Midwestern commodities. And so what you see pour into Chicago as the factories show up is livestock from across the Great Plains, corn, wheat from places like Illinois and Iowa, and lumber from the states of Minnesota and Wisconsin. The meatpacking industry in particular, especially when it came to cows and beef, was really centered in Chicago. And again, thanks to the railroads now, all of that mass-produced meat is being sent back east to the growing populations in those areas. Yet another example of a city that starts to grow in incredible importance, again, thanks to all these transportation technologies in the market, was the city of Cincinnati. Cincinnati, by the middle of the 19th century, earned the nickname Porkopolis because it was the center of pork production in America. There were far more pigs that lived in Cincinnati than actual human beings. And again, thanks to the factory system and transportation technologies, all that pork is being sent back east and really transforming American diets. Now Americans, thanks to cities like Cincinnati and Chicago, can access mass-produced cheap meat. Of course, most Americans have no idea what the process for that actually looks like, and as we'll know later on, many Americans will be absolutely mortified when they learn what the nature of unregulated capitalism in the meatpacking industry actually look like. More generally, it's always important to keep in mind that as Americans start to move into these urban environments, the very nature of these urban environments was, to say the least, not very pleasant. You can see here from this map how urban areas are starting to surge by 1840 and around Boston, cities like Providence, Rhode Island, New Haven, Connecticut, Albany, New York to Philadelphia, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Buffalo. All these cities are seeing massive increases in their population. But the problem was these cities are just extremely disgusting places to live in during this time. They were crowded. Diseases were very commonplace. Very commonplace, especially diseases that we would be absolutely horrified by today. Diseases like cholera, diseases like the plague, tuberculosis, typhus, these types of crowd diseases that really flourish. They're very commonplace among urban populations at this time. The problem with these cities is that they're extraordinarily polluted, as you can see from all these examples. Many Americans at the time said one of the worst problems with the cities was simply the smells, thanks in part to what were called the noxious trades. These were people like soap makers, tanners, slaughterhouses, butchers. There was even a line of work called the blubber boilers. These were people that bought animal fat and boiled it down to be used in other products. All these types of industries are just more further polluting these cities because of all the organic material that they utilize. In most of these cities, animals completely roamed free as scavengers, but again, they're just roaming free because there's virtually no regulation. There's no sanitation, virtually no modern infrastructure, and we see incredible pockets of wealth and then extreme poverty all over these urban areas. What I want you to make a note of, what's important to keep in mind here is that in these early cities, as they're growing, there's very, very limited regulation coming from the city governments. The view of the city governments is that in most cases, it is an individual's responsibility, especially when it comes to the realm of sanitation and public health. It was an individual's responsibility to basically take care of themselves, that the government was not going to interfere with that process. That was a very serious ideological principle that these city governments embraced. And so where you see some regulation was usually in the realm of actual marketplaces. Vendors would have to receive licenses or permits to do their operations. Sometimes cities would also set, hours when people could actually be operating their businesses. But beyond that, it was up to individuals to take care of their communities. One of the few regulations we see in place was this idea of regulating what was called night soil. Basically, if you go to any of these urban areas, there are no modern working toilets or plumbing infrastructure. So what would happen, along apartment buildings and row houses, you had these vaults, and these vaults had these sliding doors on every floor. Americans would go to the bathroom, and then they would dump the contents of their makeshift toilets into these vaults. And so at the bottom of all these buildings, organic waste would just pile up. What most cities said by law was that the vaults could not be basically emptied out until nighttime. Thus, all that organic waste, feces, urine was referred to as night soil. The idea was only nighttime is when these businesses could come in. You would pay a fee, they would pick up your night soil, and then they would deposit it or sell it as fertilizer to other farmers. The idea basically being, it's a very unseemly process, so it's something that should only go on at night. You can see right here an example. Oops, sorry, an example right here of the U.S. Sanitary Company in Washington, D.C. You pay them a fee, they'll come pick up your garbage and or night soil as long as you keep paying the fee. This question of regulation leads us to this broader problem facing the country that, as the market spreads, as capitalism spreads, should there be a role for the quote unquote visible hand? In other words, the government. Now, in Adam Smith's original ideas, the answer to that question was no, that leave it to the market, the invisible hand, to run its own affairs. But what we see by the 18 teens and 1820s is that the federal courts have to start making decisions about these problems, whether or not government does have an inherent responsibility when it comes to regulating some aspects of the economy. Where we saw this idea of the national economy and the role of government, where we first saw this as a major court case, was in 1819 in the case of McCullough versus Maryland. In this particular case, what had been happening was the state of Maryland was passing laws that basically attempted to tax the National Bank of the United States because that bank happened to be located, or elements of that bank happened to be located in the state of Maryland. Maryland's argument was that bank rests in the sovereign state of Maryland, and so the state government of Maryland has the power to tax it. Obviously, the bank sued Maryland, arguing that as a federal agency, the state of Maryland had no authority over it. The Supreme Court of Chief Justice John Marshall, remember guys, that Marshall Supreme Court, they have very, very distinct ideas about the expansive powers of the federal government. In this case, that court absolutely ruled in favor of the national bank, but it went even further than that. The court ruled that the Constitution gives the Congress of the federal government all sorts of implied powers. And what it also did was reaffirm the Supremacy Clause. This is really the first case where the Supreme Court felt the need to address the Supremacy Clause in Article 6. What it reminded the state governments was, look, you have your sovereignty and your power, but in the face of the federal government, your powers are limited. The National Bank is a federal agency, and thus the state of Maryland has literally no authority over that agency. Rather, it would be the other way around. So this was an important case in really expanding the powers of the federal government, and it leaves open the possibility that the federal government does have a lot of power when it comes to regulating capitalism in the marketplace. This question of the Supremacy Clause does come up once again, this time in 1824 in the case of Gibbons versus Ogden. In this particular case, the broader question was, who actually has the authority to regulate all these new transportation and economic networks that are starting to develop across the United States? The particular issues in this case was that by the 1920s we had a number of steamship monopolies operating in and around the state of New York. But those steamship monopolies also operated across state lines when they crossed into other states like Connecticut and New Jersey. So what happened was the state of New York began to argue that as a state government, it had the power to regulate interstate commerce. In other words, if those steamship monopolies also operate in New Jersey and Connecticut, New York could still regulate and tax them if it wanted to. This case goes before the Supreme Court, and so the Marshall Court has to rule on this fundamental question. Who has the power to regulate interstate commerce? And they are very, very clear. Only the federal government. States could not regulate businesses that occurred in their state, but then also crossed into other state boundaries. And so what this case also shows us, like the McCullough decision, was that the federal government has a lot of power when it comes to the issues of the national economy. But the very fact that these cases are occurring more generally shows that the Supreme Court now has to deal with the problems of all the sweeping changes and the novel issues that are coming up with the spread of American capitalism. All these things the founders had never foreseen because they didn't have to deal with these problems. But now the Supreme Court has to go back to the Constitution and really interpret and understand the Constitution to figure out where do all these various powers and authorities reside when it comes to the regulation of the marketplace. So we're going to conclude this unit by looking at two really important events in the year 1819. And in many ways, both these events sort of show how the country now has emerged as a full-blown free market capitalist society. In the case of this economic panic of 1819, historians have argued that basically this is the moment where the United States now is a full-blown capitalist system, because it's this economic crisis that reveals the kind of true underlying nature of American capitalism and what it actually was. Let me first set us up with the precise causes for this economic panic in 1819. It really begins in the year 1816. In that year, strangely enough, this has everything to do with a massive volcanic eruption in the Dutch East Indies. That volcanic eruption altered weather patterns that then affected temperatures across the European continent. Following that volcanic eruption, Europe experienced basically throughout that year really below normal temperatures. That's why many people in 1816 referred to it as Europe's year without a summer. As the temperatures dropped really dramatically for an entire year, that had an incredibly detrimental impact on European agriculture, which, as we've already talked about, was already experiencing a lot of problems after the Napoleonic Wars. In that type of situation, there's a vacuum. And American producers of food really stood to gain. As European agriculture failed throughout 1816, American food prices in turn really went up because European markets were desperate for food. And so keep that in mind. There's a lot of money by 1816 to be made, especially in commercial food production. And so that then trickled out more broadly to the American economy. The problem was between 1811 and 1816, the central bank was gone temporarily, the first bank having been dissolved by law. And so in this type of atmosphere, speculation is rampant. Surging food prices are leading ordinary Americans now to take out a lot of debt to speculate on land prices. Many Americans are betting that as food goes up and land prices go up, they stood to gain by making a lot of money. And so the problem was banks, which were also making a lot of money, were lending out way more credit than the metallic currency, in other words, gold and silver. So they're lending out more credit than what they actually can sustainably do because they don't really have that much metallic currency in reserve to back up all that credit they're lending out. This whole problem came to a head by 1816. When the Second Bank of the United States was chartered, one of the first things it did was looked at all the speculation and risky borrowing practices, and it clamped down on it. The Second Bank of the United States required most banks across the country to start calling in their debts. They're doing this again to make sure that there isn't so much currency in circulation that it actually leads to all sorts of problems with inflation. The problem was, if you do this all at once, it creates panic in the banking system. All of a sudden, all these banks recognized that all the people that borrowed from them simply didn't have the money to pay them back. This in turn coincided with a global drop in food prices as European economies recovered by the year 1819. And so it's in that year, as the banks are being clamped down upon and being required to call in their debts, where you see a full-blown economic panic in the United States. We now know this economic panic was absolutely necessary. It's a market correction. The market was overinflated. It had to come back down to earth. But what you see happen in 1819 is that as it becomes clear that the country was suffering from unsustainable debt, there's a run on the banks. When people run on the banks and they panic, that then creates an even bigger crisis. Banks started failing, people experienced foreclosures, farmers lost everything, all that land that they had basically purchased through risky speculation and credit access. That in turn trickled out to companies all across the country failing overnight. And so there were hundreds of thousands of American workers who lost everything, their jobs, their homes, you name it. And so this is a full-blown economic crisis facing the country, and it does spark a sort of mini depression for the country, the first real mini depression in the nation's young history. Now, eventually the country would recover from the Panic of 1819. But why it's important to us when we think about the history of American capitalism is how the Panic of 1819 kind of revealed some fundamental truths about capitalism and capitalist behavior in American society. For one thing, what we see are basically sort of three core qualities to what capitalist behavior now entails in American society. And in many ways, guys, those qualities have really stood the test of time. They really emerged by 1819, but if you fast forward well through 2008 and the Great Recession and up to the present, you're still going to see most of these qualities as really sort of predominant capitalist behavior in this country. Number one was the embrace of risk. There's no doubt about it that Americans, ordinary and well-to-do, are embracing the conception of risk with the goal of making as much money as possible. By the 1820s, it was pretty clear that all the accessing of credit, people taking on a lot of risk, engaging in a lot of speculation, that those were just core foundations of capitalist thinking, that risk is just a part of the game. What also became very clear as part of capitalist behavior was straight up aggression. When you look at Americans embracing the marketplace, it's very clear that capitalist behavior sometimes entailed impulses that could be seemingly benign, like ambition and the pursuit of self-interest and success. But what also sometimes came with that was violence, both in very symbolic ways, simply the way people talked about self-pursuits and entrepreneurship, but also in very real violence, as we're going to see, especially when it comes to the capitalism of slavery. Violence was absolutely part of that entire process. But what we're also going to see is that with this aggression, with this constant need to be successful, this leads to this constant sense of a drive, constantly trying to be successful, but inevitably never quite achieving full-blown success, even when one has achieved economic success in this system. Many outside observers start to notice by the 1830s that American capitalist behavior, more than anything else, is really dominated by this sense of discontentment, that even when you pursue your self-interest and even when you're successful, it's never, ever enough. There's something about that that becomes sort of a part of being an American more broadly. Lastly, what we see in the Panic of 1819 is that it reveals this fundamental love-hate relationship with regulation in the United States. On the one hand, ordinary Americans blamed the central banking system and its regulatory powers for creating the crisis to begin with. And that may be true, but the view among many Americans was that the central bank and regulation more generally was unfairly restraining free market pursuits. And thus, as Adam Smith would say, anything that restrains your free market pursuits is also restraining your inherent natural rights and liberty. At the same time, though, what we see in the crisis of 1819 is that even while Americans blamed the central bank and regulation for causing the crisis, Americans increasingly also wanted more regulatory protections from economic collapse. And so we see this in a variety of forms. People arguing that there should be forms of debt relief, bankruptcy laws to protect you, and also property guarantees. In other words, if you engage risky and aggressive speculation behavior, many Americans start to argue that there should be protections in place, that you should not be punished for your risky behavior or your bad investments. But that in itself is an even more problematic issue, as we're going to see. Finally, guys, what we're going to conclude with for this unit is looking at another crisis that also occurred in 1819, and it's not mutually exclusive. It's not independent from the overarching national panic of 1819, but there is a crisis brewing in the territory of Missouri, and it has a lot to do with these broader questions about the expansion of the territory of the United States, the expansion of American capitalism, but of course the problem of slavery itself. The problem in 1819 is that in the midst of this economic panic facing the country, we see a huge wave of slaveholders who are scrambling into the territory of Missouri in order to gobble up land, spread slavery, spread cotton, but in some cases, many of these slaveholders are also attempting to escape outstanding debts that they owe in their home states. By 1819, Missouri has enough people and a territorial government to enter the Union as a new state. The problem was this state, potentially, if it enters the Union, also has a population of 10,000 slaves. So it's pretty clear that if Missouri enters the Union, it will enter as a slave state and thus upset the equal balance in the United States Senate. Up until that point, you had an even number of slave state senators and free state senators because, again, every state was guaranteed 2 senators. So as the United States Congress is debating this issue, whether or not Missouri should enter the Union as a new state, a New York congressman named James Talmadge proposed an amendment to Missouri's potential admission. His proposal was that Missouri could enter the Union, but he argued that future slavery should be restricted. Thus, no new slaves could be brought into the state, and all the slaves in the state would eventually be freed. He proposed basically a gradual emancipation law, as you can see here. It would mandate that all children under the age of 25 would automatically be freed at the age of 25. Thus, in about a generation or two, there would be no more slavery in the state of Missouri. The problem was most Southern congressmen and senators simply could not accept that proposal. They did not like the idea of the United States government imposing upon a potential state what that state should be doing with regards to slavery or any other type of labor system. So instead, during very heated debate in 1819 and 1820, the Congress sits down and it was able to reach a compromise to try and nip this crisis in the bud. You can see the 3 key elements of this so-called Missouri Compromise of 1820 right here. Number 1, Missouri will absolutely enter the Union as a slave state. But in order for it to be balanced out in the Senate, it was also agreed that Maine would also enter the Union, but clearly as a free state. That was actually the easiest part of this compromise, being able to balance out the numbers of slave and free states. The real tough and touchy issue was figuring out the future of slavery. If you recall, and let me just zoom in this map to show you what I'm talking about. If you go back to 1787, the U.S. government had imposed restrictions on the spread of slavery right here, north of the Ohio River, meaning that these future states, which they eventually do become as full states, will not have any slavery. South of the Ohio River, slavery could spread. That law worked because the limits of the country stopped at the Mississippi. The problem was, with Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase all right here, there was no law in the books that actually said where slavery could or could not go. So the question of Missouri was really framed within this larger question about the Louisiana Purchase territory. The U.S. Congress had to figure out in its compromise what to do about future slavery now in the remaining Louisiana territory. And so that was the third component right here of this compromise, the creation of the so-called Missouri Line. What it said, this is the southern boundary of Missouri, it's just extended to the farthest reaches of the United States up to this point. It said all this territory north of the line would be free from slavery. This territory down here could have slavery. That was seen as the compromise. People felt that they had nipped a potential crisis in the bud. Long term, though, it's pretty clear. The Missouri crisis revealed a fundamental problem facing the country. There is a sectional divide growing in this country regarding the spread of slavery. But the willingness of all sides to compromise also showed an unfortunate reality about American capitalism at the time. And that reality was that American capitalism depended a great deal upon slavery's expansion. The recognition both North and South made that compromise possible. Long term, no one really wanted to restrict the spread of slavery, ideally. But the sense was this probably wouldn't be an issue much longer because of the Missouri Line's establishment right here. But as you can see, I wrote right here, the keywords are for now. The reality is, as the United States continues to expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean, it will ultimately lead to new territorial questions about the spread of slavery. That will be an issue we're going to take a look at in more detail later on. So that's it for Unit 3. If any of you have any questions or need any clarification about this material, I am happy to meet with you guys individually or just shoot me an email and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks very much and have a good week.